At the company party, everything seemed to be going on as usual. The music was loud, the lights were dim, and the smiles were forced, mixed with excessive doses of cheap wine. I was holding a half-empty glass, looking around with the neutrality of someone who wasn't expecting any big surprises. It was just another night, one of those nights where you can pretend that everyone likes each other, that the compliments are sincere, that the looks don't carry ulterior motives. But in a matter of seconds, my world fell apart before my eyes. My wife, my woman, my rock, my love of so many years, let go of my hand in the middle of the room, as if she were letting go of a dead weight, and walked with a smile that I no longer recognized towards her boss. She grabbed him by the waist with a fierce and provocative intimacy, and pulled him to dance. She knew I was there. She knew I was watching her. She knew what that meant. And yet, she danced. With him. As if I had never existed. I walked up to them both, my throat tight, my chest on fire, my eyes wet with anger and pain, and asked, "What does this mean?" She didn't hesitate, she didn't waver, she didn't apologize. She just said, "It means I prefer him." Each word she said was a knife to my gut. Cold. Cynical. Final. In that moment, I was no longer a husband, no longer a man, no longer a human being. I was a specter crushed by the reality of a public betrayal. I felt the stares. I felt the whispers. I felt the shame. I walked out of there. Destroyed. Each step toward my house felt like 1,000 tons dragging along the dignity I had left. I got home and, without thinking, I did what needed to be done. I wrote the divorce letter with trembling but firm hands. Harsh, painful, but necessary words. I didn't want any more explanations, no more eyes asking for forgiveness, no more speeches of regret. It was too late. Very late. The next day, she read the letter. And when she realized that it wasn't a bluff, that I was really leaving, that my love had turned to ash and dust, she came to her senses. And then the belated spectacle of regret began. Messages. Phone calls. Letters. Crying. Promises. Please. But time doesn't come back. And a broken heart doesn't mend in the same way. She tried everything. She showed up at my door, saying she was lost, that she had made the worst choice of her life. She said her boss didn't want anything to do with her anymore, that it was all an impulse, that she was confused, that she felt alone. She cried. She begged. She rang my doorbell in the middle of the night saying she couldn't sleep without me, that our story was too big to end like that. But the truth is that what was broken there wasn't just the marriage. It was the respect. It was the foundation. It was the us. And when that's broken, there's no going back. I was already far away. In another place emotionally, in another stage of myself. The cruelest thing for her, and the most silently liberating thing for me, was watching her witness my new beginning. She saw me slowly getting my life back on track. She saw that I didn't give in. That I didn't stay at the bottom of the well she threw me into. She saw that my pain made me reborn. And she saw, with her own eyes, what she perhaps never expected to see, me loving another woman. A woman who didn't carry lies in her smile. Who didn't hide cynicism behind affection. A woman who looked at me as if every second were unique, and who valued every gesture. That destroyed her more than any revenge I could have devised. And I didn't have to lift a finger. She saw me smiling for real. She saw me more handsome. Lighter. She saw me holding hands with someone in places we used to go. She saw me fulfilled, while she, little by little, sank into the emptiness of her own choice. Because those who betray easily believe that the door will always be ajar. But she found a wall where there used to be an entrance. And that was the final blow. The most brutal blow. The world she had destroyed became a movie from which she was removed in the middle of the session. And she watched from the audience at the end, without the right to resume her role. The taste of regret came too late. When she tried to come back, there was no more room. When she realized what she had lost, what was love was already a memory. And worse, I was happy. With someone better. With someone who awakened in me what she had long buried with contempt. And that is the true punishment for those who betray, discovering that the other, the one who was betrayed, managed to be stronger, more worthy, more loved. And that his absence was not only overcome, but celebrated. She still writes to me. She says she never forgot me. She says she prays every night for me to forgive her. She says she sees me in her dreams. But now I'm just a ghost in her life. A distant echo of what she destroyed with her own hands. A reflection of what she'll never have again. And me? I moved on. With the lightness of someone who suffered the worst and survived. With the maturity of someone who understood that love is not enough when there is no respect. With the peace of mind of knowing that life will take care of getting even, without having to get our hands dirty. What she didn't know, what perhaps no one knew, is that I had suspected something for some time. That her smile, half hidden on her cell phone, that unusual rush to go to work, those cold hugs, were already telling me a silent story. But I preferred to keep quiet. I preferred to believe. I preferred to give credit to love. And when the truth came like a slap, I didn't fight for something that had already died. I buried it with dignity. And I lived the morning until the morning set me free. Betrayal hurts. It corrodes. It kills a part of us that may never come back. But, curiously, it also reveals the other. It exposes who is the traitor, the weak, the selfish. And it shows us, the betrayed, that we are made of something stronger than we imagined. Her betrayal revealed my strength. And her absence revealed how much I can be loved. The irony of it all is that she betrayed me thinking she would gain something better. But she lost the best she ever had. And me? I gained myself. In the end, what hurt her the most wasn't the weight of the betrayal, nor the loneliness that followed. It was seeing me with someone else. Seeing me happy with someone else. A woman she knew. A woman who had always been there. A woman she had once taken for granted. Because this woman was everything she had pretended to be. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. Something that neither she, nor I, nor anyone else could have predicted. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Never, all the stories told are fictional, but reflect painful truths about the real consequences of selfish choices. Our goal is to show how betrayal destroys homes, breaks trust and marks hearts forever. Now take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear next is an intense, dramatic and shocking story. Brace yourself. The truth hurts. Daniel and Clara were a couple that, in everyone's eyes, represented the perfect balance between love, companionship and mutual admiration. They had been together for 9 years and married for 4. They met at a university event and, from the beginning, there was a calm and mature connection between them, different from the crazy passion of young romances. It was the kind of relationship built on dialogue, patience and the sum of small routines that, over time, had transformed into emotional rituals. Daniel was an architect, one of those who loved clean lines and symmetry, and Clara worked in the finance department of a large company, with her eye always on the numbers and the organization that gave her a sense of control over her life. For years, they lived in a subtle harmony, where the silences they shared were as comfortable as the nighttime laughter. They woke up together, had coffee listening to the same songs as always, said goodbye with hurried kisses and met again at the end of the day as if, somehow, everything revolved around that return. They had a cozy apartment, decorated in neutral tones and with plants scattered around the corners of the living room, a reflection of Clara's good taste and Daniel's sensitivity. Every corner of the house held a memory, the armchair they bought together on a trip to Buenos Aires, the pictures of the trails they took on the weekends, the lamp on the bedside table that Clara insisted on keeping on even though the bulb flickered. They planned to have children, but there was no rush. They liked to live in the present, believing that everything would come in its own time. They talked about the future constantly, but always lightly. They talked about opening a bed and breakfast in the mountains, backpacking through Europe, adopting a puppy, and growing old watching the sunset from the balcony. Nothing grand, nothing unrealistic, just possible dreams, sustained by a routine that seemed solid and predictable. Daniel was one of those attentive men who noticed a new haircut, remembered important dates, and prepared simple surprises like notes left on the mirror or a special coffee on the weekend. He had a calmness that disarmed any tension and a genuine listening style that made Clara feel that her words mattered. He was discreet, reserved, but deeply intense when it came to the feelings he harbored. He was never the type to expose much, but in small gestures he revealed a love that grew silently. Clara, on the other hand, was practical, intelligent, strong-willed, but with a heart full of sweetness. She knew what she wanted, had ambitions, and was dedicated to work and also to her relationship. She always made sure to keep everything in order, her finances, her plans, her home, and even her emotions. She knew how to deal with crises and resolve conflicts with a rare maturity, which made their relationship, to a certain extent, enviable for those around them. Their closest friends always saw them as an example. During dinners as a couple, during weekend get-togethers, it was common to hear comments like, "You understand each other just by looking at each other," or, "It's beautiful to see how you respect each other." And, in fact, there was respect. Clara supported Daniel in his projects, even when he spent sleepless nights creating sketches and renderings that were never finished. And he, in turn, was always interested in her anxieties and triumphs at work, even though he didn't understand a word about financial analysis. The dialogue between them was constant, honest and, as far as anyone could tell, free of resentment. They went through difficult times like any couple, but they always seemed to come out stronger. There was unemployment, a move to a new city, illness in the family, tension with relatives, and yet they remained together, strong, side by side. They were accomplices, and complicity, more than desire or passion, seemed to be what kept them together. However, there was something growing silently, and neither of them seemed to notice. It wasn't an obvious crisis, nor a blatant absence. It was a sum of scattered moments, small distances that were accumulating. Clara, increasingly involved with work, taking on new responsibilities, constant meetings, unattainable goals. Daniel, immersed in projects, seeking recognition, trying to open his own office. The hours spent together were decreasing, fatigue was setting in, kisses were becoming too quick, touches were less frequent. But nothing that sounded alarming, nothing that would set off a red alert. It was just life, being life. And, like many couples, they carried on like that, trusting in the love they had built, believing that stability was synonymous with eternity. The weekends became quieter, the conversations more technical, the laughter less spontaneous. There were no fights, no outbursts. Just the routine that stretched like a mist between the two. And yet, if asked, they would say they were fine. And indeed they were, within the normality that surrounded them. They kept up appearances, not out of vanity, but because they truly believed that this phase would pass. It always did. Life as a couple was made of this, phases. At least that was what Clara would say when she caught herself daydreaming at night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom. And Daniel agreed, even when the loneliness in the middle of the relationship began to echo within him. Clara had gained recognition within the company. She was respected, admired, had risen quickly and now shared the leadership of important projects with strategic names on the board. Among these names, there was one in particular that began to appear more frequently in her routine. A new manager, coming from another unit, who arrived as reinforcement for a period of restructuring at the company. Young, ambitious, eloquent. Someone who knew how to make himself heard, who praised publicly, who looked with interest and spoke with intensity. A man who seemed to immediately understand the language Clara was used to using, results, recognition, merit. At first, it was just that. An efficient, productive working partnership. But the exchanges became more personal. Meeting lunches turned into longer conversations, messages sent out after hours, inside jokes. Clara, who had always been extremely rational, began to feel something she couldn't name. It was a mixture of excitement and discomfort. A strange enthusiasm, a slight butterflies in her stomach. But nothing major. She still loved Daniel, she was still married, she still came home every day. There was nothing wrong. Not at all. Meanwhile, Daniel was working on the most daring project he had ever accepted, the construction of a cultural center in a historic neighborhood. It was a contract that could change his career and put his name in the spotlight. He would spend entire days away, visiting the site, meeting with investors, and adjusting budgets. At night, he would come back exhausted. Clara was already asleep. On the weekends, when he wasn't working with drawing boards and 3D models, he tried to be present. He would make breakfast, suggest watching a movie, propose an outing. Sometimes Clara would accept, sometimes she would say she needed to get some work done. And he understood. He always understood. Maybe too much. Even with the misunderstandings, there was love. When they looked into each other's eyes, there was still memory. When they laughed about some old memory, there was still connection. But the frequency of this diminished. The love was still there, but it seemed covered by a thin layer of tiredness. It still existed, but less visible. Less touchable. Time, silently, rearranged them on opposite sides of a life that once seemed to be for two. No one cheated. No one lied. No one yelled. No one left. Yet. The company party was approaching. An important annual event that brought together employees from all departments. Clara, as one of the team leaders, would play a prominent role in the organization. She was excited, more for the prestige than for the celebration itself. Daniel decided to accompany her, as he always did, even though it wasn't the kind of environment he enjoyed. He wanted to be there for her. He wanted to see her shine, even from afar. He chose an elegant outfit, prepared a symbolic gift for her to deliver the next day, and booked a restaurant to celebrate his wife's professional advancement. He didn't know that that night would be the turning point. He didn't imagine that something, in that atmosphere of loud music and warm lights, would forever change the course of the story he believed he was living. And yet, everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. The night of the party arrived surrounded by silent anticipation. Clara left the room wearing a wine-colored dress that highlighted her restrained elegance, the kind of elegance that didn't need to draw attention to itself to be noticed. Daniel watched her in silence for a few seconds, with a discreet smile on his lips, the kind of smile that reveals pride and tenderness in equal measure. He commented that she looked beautiful, and she responded with a quick thank you, picking up her bag while checking her cell phone once more. He didn't notice, but that night, she was wearing a different perfume, sweeter, more intense, an unusual choice for someone who always preferred soft scents. During the drive to the event venue, they spoke little. Daniel mentioned a new project that might require a short trip soon, and Clara nodded absently, while exchanging messages that he didn't ask who they were from. They arrived at the hall lit by golden tones, with background music and a constant buzz of mixed voices. There were colleagues everywhere, rehearsed smiles, formal greetings. Clara was immediately absorbed by her team, while Daniel stayed behind, pouring himself a glass of wine and observing everything with a certain respectful distance. She seemed confident, gliding among the guests as if that environment were a natural extension of herself. She spoke firmly, laughed lightly, and every now and then her eyes would meet Daniel's from across the room, and she would smile in a restrained way, as if to signal, "I'm here, but I'm busy." He didn't mind. He was used to giving her space, to understanding. He knew that that night was important to her, and that his presence there was more of a gesture of support than of direct participation. However, as the hours passed, something began to change. Daniel began to notice a strange frequency in Clara's glances in a specific direction. A tall man, in a gray blazer, with a beard and an easy smile. They were talking too close together. They were laughing about something that only they seemed to understand. They touched each other's arms familiarly. Daniel tried not to interpret anything. He tried to keep reason above intuition. After all, he was her boss, or at least that's what she had mentioned a few weeks earlier. A new manager, someone who had a good relationship with the team. But what Daniel saw was not just a professional relationship. Clara and the man walked away a few times to have more private conversations. Once in the garden outside, another time near the bar, and then in one of the side corridors. Daniel didn't follow them. He didn't want to seem insecure or controlling. But something inside him began to tighten with a dull force. He tried to distract himself, to start conversations with other guests, but his eyes always returned to where she was. And she seemed less and less present. When she returned to the ballroom, she had a euphoric expression on her face, like someone who's going through something they don't want to interrupt. Daniel tried to suppress his discomfort. He didn't want to turn that night into a bitter memory. But his chest felt like a stone. At a certain point, he saw her dancing with her boss. First, in a group, among colleagues. Then the music changed, and the others left the dance floor. The two of them were left alone. His arm naturally wrapped around her waist. Her hands rested on his shoulders as if they had done it before. Clara's body fit against his as if she already knew the way. Daniel froze. A numbness took hold of his legs, as if he were anchored to the ground by invisible roots. Everything around him became muffled, as if the sound of the party had been covered by a thick veil of disbelief. He walked toward them, swallowing the pain rising in his throat. He stopped in front of the couple and, in a firm but low voice, asked what that meant. Clara didn't hesitate, didn't look away, didn't feel embarrassed. She simply said that it meant she preferred the other guy. No more words, no justifications, no beating around the bush. A sentence. Daniel didn't answer. There were no words. He just turned around and walked slowly toward the exit, crossing the hall as if he were in a parallel world, where the ground moved beneath his feet. Outside, the night air seemed heavier. Humiliation mixed with confusion, with tiredness, with the echo of the phrase that still hammered in his head. She preferred him. How could someone say that so coldly? How could someone abandon a love, a story, in front of an audience? He drove home with his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Each red light was a forced pause to contain the whirlwind. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't knock. He just remained silent. A dense, absolute silence that invaded even the most intimate spaces of his soul. When he arrived, he simply turned on the living room light, took off his shoes as if he didn't want to wake up ghosts, and sat down on the sofa. He grabbed paper and a pen and wrote. The divorce letter was born there, in just a few lines. Clara didn't deserve any more explanations. She didn't deserve any more time. She didn't deserve any more space in his life. The marriage had died on that dance floor. He enveloped the letter, left it on the kitchen table, turned off the light, and went to sleep. He slept little. He woke up early. And he left the house before she came back. Late in the afternoon, Clara arrived. She walked in slowly, still wearing her party clothes, her hair tied up in a hasty way, as if she was trying to pretend nothing had happened. When she saw the envelope, she hesitated for a few seconds. Then, she opened it. She read it. Not once, but several times. Her body went limp. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall. Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, he seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. She tried to call. She sent messages. No response. The following days were a succession of failed attempts. He showed up at his door. He left notes. He asked to talk. He promised that everything could be different. That he still loved him. That he had lost himself for a moment. He didn't know what he was doing. But Daniel didn't give in. He was already on another frequency, in another time. He was too hurt to allow her to touch him again. Clara began to wither inside. She began to avoid colleagues, refuse invitations, and neglect her work. The same environment that had once exalted her now suffocated her. The man she had left her husband for did not seek her out after the party. No contact, no word. It was as if it had all been a game to him. Clara realized this too late. And the more she realized it, the more she felt the bitter taste of loss. Daniel's absence hurt like the absence of herself. She looked at the objects in the house and everything reminded her of what they had built. The coffee he liked, the crooked pillow he fixed every day, the sound of his laughter as he watched the same old program. Everything was empty now. While she sank, Daniel rebuilt himself. Discreetly, slowly, silently. He found shelter in his work, in his remaining friends, in the silence that once hurt him and now strengthened him. He discovered new passions, new paths, new purposes. Little by little, he began to smile again. Without guilt. Without fear. Without her. But there was something he still didn't know. Something that Clara carried silently, like a shadow. A detail that was not revealed. A secret that, when it came to light, would change everything again. Because there are pains that drag on beyond the end. And some truths were still about to explode. Time passed as it does for those who need to learn to live with absence. Clara persisted in the first weeks, then in the first months, and finally fell silent like someone who understands that she has lost not only the other person, but also herself. Daniel moved on. He changed his address, changed his routine, rebuilt his life without carrying the debris of a shattered love. He made a point of not looking back, not out of anger, but because he knew that each memory was a risk of relapse. There was no longer any pain, just an emptiness filled with new landscapes, new conversations, new possibilities. He was getting back on his feet like a man who has hit rock bottom and learned to walk without support. However, he did not expect to meet her again. And much less in that way. It was a random afternoon at a cultural center where he worked as a consultant for a social project. He was with a group of young apprentices when the coordinator drew his attention to a new volunteer who had been approved to work in the administrative sector. He wasn't interested until he saw her come through the door with a dejected but determined expression. Clara. Her eyes sought him with a mixture of shame and hope. He kept his gaze steady but neutral. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and went back to his group. She, in turn, sat at a table in the back and focused on her papers. For a few days, they worked closely together without exchanging more than polite greetings. But it was impossible to completely ignore the tension between the two. Their glances met and the silences stretched out longer than was acceptable. Until, one gray afternoon, Clara plucked up the courage. She waited for everyone to leave the room, approached Daniel and said in a low voice that she needed to talk, that there was something she had never had the courage to tell him, but that now she could no longer bear it alone. He took a deep breath, considered refusing, but something in the way she looked at him convinced him that there was something more. They walked together to the inner courtyard, where the sound of the fountain softened the atmosphere. They sat on opposite benches, far apart, but connected by an invisible tension. Clara began by saying that she knew he no longer owed her anything, that he had probably already moved on, and everything indicated that he had, but that he still deserved to hear what she had kept back, out of cowardice, fear, pride. Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at the floor in front of him, waiting for her to get straight to the point. And she did. With a ragged breath and a choked voice, she revealed that he didn't know the whole story. She said that, months before the party, she had started getting closer to her boss, as he had noticed, but that their involvement hadn't started as an explicit betrayal, but rather as an emotional need, as an escape from a routine that suffocated her and that she didn't have the courage to face. Daniel already knew this, in a way. What he didn't know, and what made her hesitate before continuing, was what had really happened after the party. Clara confessed that, the morning after their breakup, she went to her boss's apartment believing she had made a choice, even though she didn't know what kind of choice it was. But when she arrived, she found another woman leaving the building, wearing the same clothes as the night before, kissing him intimately at the door. Clara understood at that moment that there had never been any reciprocity. That it had been just another fling for him. She returned home in shock, trying to process the chain of bad decisions she had made. And yet, that wasn't the most painful part. What came next was. Daniel finally looked up, looking at her intently. She held back her tears, and with desperate determination, revealed the secret she had always feared he would know. The woman who had started that relationship with her boss, days before the party, was Daniel's new girlfriend. A piercing silence fell between the two. Daniel frowned, not understanding at first. Clara, seeing that he didn't connect the dots, continued. She explained that after the divorce, when she saw that Daniel was getting closer to a new woman, a mutual friend who had shown up at some parties, she began to notice her obsessively. She started following her on social media, found old photos and started putting the pieces together. Until she discovered that, weeks before the party, this woman had attended a meeting at the company where Clara worked, invited by a mutual acquaintance, and that, on that occasion, she had had a brief affair with Clara's boss. An affair that he had omitted, but that Clara caught by accident, in an internal chat group that she shouldn't have had access to. Upon discovering this, Clara felt a kind of inner fury. A feeling of possession that she didn't know still existed. She wanted to prove that she could also seduce, that she was also desirable, that she could be more than just an ignored wife in the midst of routine. And then, unconsciously, he started a kind of sick game. He got even closer to his boss, intensified his contacts, allowed flirting to turn into desire, and desire to turn into transgression. All of this not only out of need, but out of competition. An invisible war against a woman who didn't even know she was being used as a weapon. It took Daniel a few seconds to understand what she was saying. When he finally did, he stood up from the bench as if the floor had disappeared. He walked in circles, ran his hands through his hair, and asked quietly, more to himself than to her, if this was serious. Clara got up too, tried to get closer, but he backed away. He asked her why she never told him. She replied that she was afraid. That at first she didn't believe he would really go on with that woman, and then it was too late. She was crying now. She said she had no intention of destroying him, that she just wanted to prove herself alive, desired, important. But she knew she had made a mistake. She knew she had been cruel, petty, and inconsequential. Daniel, for his part, remained motionless for long minutes. The pain was no longer anger. It was something deeper, like a double betrayal. The woman who had abandoned him and the woman who had appeared to save him were, in some way, linked by a past he was unaware of. He asked if the new woman knew. Clara said no. That the boss had probably omitted this involvement out of convenience. And that the other woman was perhaps just another one among many in his web. There was silence again. Daniel looked up at the cloudy sky as if searching for answers in the clouds. Then he turned to Clara and said in a calm but firm voice that this was the last conversation between them. Not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation. That hearing this was like discovering that the ground he was standing on was not only unstable, but false. And that he could no longer harbor any affection for a story where he was just a pawn in someone else's game. Clara tried to say something, but he waved his hand and walked away. He walked down the hallway to the gate of the cultural center, without looking back. That night, for the first time in months, Daniel did not sleep. He lay in absolute silence, in the dark, feeling the weight of all the truths he had ignored. He realized that, even after the entire process of reconstruction, there were still internal cracks that he had not faced. But in that moment, they became visible, and for the first time he knew exactly what he needed to do. Because there are truths that, when revealed, do not just change the course of history. They close entire chapters with subtle violence. As if everything that came before was just a prologue. And what would come after, finally, was the true beginning. Daniel avoided the cultural center for the next few days. He asked for permission from the project, left the group in the hands of another architect, and went to bed without giving any further explanation. That conversation with Clara had opened up a deeper internal tear than he thought he would ever be able to bear again. It wasn't just the pain of having been betrayed, of having been publicly dumped by a man who wanted nothing more than a momentary whim. It was the brutal, crushing realization that he had rebuilt his life on ruins that still hid poison. The woman with whom he was beginning to believe he could start over, who had brought him peace amidst the chaos and offered him a kind of affection he thought was extinct, was part of a web that was now revealing its vile, intertwined lines. And even if there was no direct fault on her part, the bond existed, and that was enough to make Daniel doubt everything again. He began to avoid even the places he used to frequent. The cafe on the corner, the park where he ran in the morning, the small bookstore where he had rediscovered the pleasure of solitude. He began to walk through streets he didn't know well, aimlessly, without rushing, just allowing his steps to guide him out of himself. One day, without knowing how, he ended up sitting on a park bench in the late afternoon, watching children play with a worn-out ball while old people played dominoes under the shade of a tree. It was a scene so alien to his pain that, for a moment, he felt angry. Angry at how the world went on as normal, at how no one seemed to notice that he was carrying an implosion inside him. But he also felt a strange form of relief. There was life beyond his story, there was movement beyond his suffering. And perhaps this, more than any consolation, was what he needed to realize. That same night, he received an unexpected message. It came from her, the woman with whom he had begun a new chapter. The message was simple but direct: "We need to talk. Please, listen to me." Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to face the truth anymore, he didn't want to stir up wounds anymore, but something about the way she wrote, no excuses, no justifications, made him respond. He arranged to meet her 2 days later, at a small restaurant where they usually had lunch on their first dates. When he arrived, she was already waiting for him, sitting at a table in the corner, her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the door. She was dressed soberly, her face free of makeup, her hair tied up in an unpretentious way. He sat down without greeting her with a touch or a smile. He just leaned back in his chair and waited. She wasted no time. He said that she had heard about Clara, that she had contacted him shortly after their conversation at the cultural center. That Clara had told him everything, dropping the bombshell on her lap with a mixture of relief and revenge. He said he was in shock, that he felt nauseous, that he stayed away for days, trying to process it. Daniel remained silent. She continued. She explained that she had actually been at that meeting, that she had met the man, that she had gotten involved with him for a few weeks, without imagining the impact that it would have months later. That it was something fleeting, unimportant, and that she had never crossed paths with him again after that. And that, in a suit, she had only connected the dots when Clara revealed everything. She said she would understand if he didn't want to see her anymore, if he thought it was all a farce, but that she needed to make it clear, she had never played games, never lied, never used him. That the affection she had built for him was true, clean, different from anything she had ever felt. Daniel took a deep breath. He looked at her with softer eyes, as if trying to separate the past from the present with tweezers. For a moment, he saw in her the same woman who had offered him comfort without demanding anything, who had a calm gaze and a light laugh. But the weight of the revelation was still there. He had said he needed time. She understood. She didn't cry, she didn't ask for anything. He simply nodded with teary eyes and stood up. That same week, Clara went back to look for him. She knocked on the door of the new apartment and waited in silence, even though she knew he might not open it. Daniel, out of impulse or exhaustion, opened it. She didn't say anything right away. She just handed him an envelope with a handwritten letter. He said it was the last time he would bother him. That he didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, he just wanted him to read it when he felt like it was possible. Then he turned and left. Daniel held the envelope for a few minutes, standing, looking at it as if staring at a time capsule. He only opened it at night, when the apartment was silent. The letter wasn't a confession. It was an apology, yes, but it was also an intimate account of regret. Clara spoke of how her ego, pride, and feelings of abandonment had distorted her perception of reality. She said that, when she saw Daniel rebuilding himself with another woman, she felt discarded, replaced, forgotten. And that this consumed her. She admitted that for years she had used strength as a shield, trying to maintain control over everything, including him, without even realizing it. And that now she understood that love is not held back by domination, but by truth. She ended by saying that if he had found someone capable of loving him with the same care that she had neglected, then he should be happy. Because, despite everything, he deserved it. The words pierced him like blades. There was pain, yes, but also a strange form of liberation. It was as if Clara had finally freed him from the cycle. The next day, Daniel didn't look for anyone. He didn't send messages, he didn't answer calls. He just went for a walk. He went to the beach, where the water gently touched the sand. He sat down in front of the sea and stayed there for hours, without looking at his cell phone, without thinking about work, without hearing voices. Just breathing. At the end of the afternoon, he wrote a single message. It was to the woman he had distanced himself from. "Can we talk again?" She replied almost immediately. They arranged to meet at the same place. This time, the meeting was different. He arrived feeling lighter. He ordered a coffee, sat down across from her, and began to talk. He said that there were still open wounds, that he was still trying to understand what it all meant. But he also said that, for the first time, he didn't feel angry. That he wanted to try to rebuild, not in a hurry, but with truth. That if she was willing to walk with him, even though she knew the road would be uncertain, then he would like to stay by her side. She smiled with her eyes. They didn't get up, they didn't hug. They just stood there, like two survivors who finally decide to build something new on clean ground. On the way back home, Daniel felt something different. It wasn't complete happiness, nor total relief. It was a kind of serenity that comes after the storm. He knew that much was yet to come. That the consequences of that web of events would still echo in his memories. But now he had a choice. And, most importantly, he had clarity. And sometimes, that alone is more than enough to start over. After that silent and meaningful reunion, something settled inside Daniel, not as a definitive answer, but as a truce between the past and the future. He spent the following days trying to find a rhythm that made sense for that new moment, no longer trapped by the pain of betrayal, but also still far from the complete surrender that a new love demands. He didn't want to run over time, but he couldn't live in suspense either. The woman with whom he had begun to build something, even after the unexpected revelation about her past with Clara's former boss, demonstrated a serenity that calmed him. She didn't demand, she didn't force, she just was. And her presence, discreet, firm, unhurried, gained space in Daniel's life in an almost imperceptible but deeply welcoming way. Still, there were days when everything seemed to come back with force. Sudden images, unspoken words, hypotheses that mixed with reality and created an inner turmoil. Daniel knew that it wasn't just about overcoming a betrayal or dealing with a secret. It was more than that. It was about rebuilding himself with a new version of himself, a version that now understood how far human beings are capable of hurting and being hurt, but also of forgiving and starting over. The scars were there, and he had learned that they didn't need to be erased for a new story to be written. They just needed to be integrated. The challenge now was to allow love to be reborn without carrying the ghosts that insisted on whispering in his ear in moments of doubt. Clara, on the other hand, disappeared for weeks. Not for lack of will, but because she understood that her presence at that point in history was no longer welcome. She had crossed all possible limits, had let herself be carried away by bitter vanity, by a need to prove something that not even she understood anymore. And now she was dealing with the echo of her own choices. She changed jobs, sold the apartment she had previously shared with Daniel and went to live alone in a more remote neighborhood, where no one recognized her, where she could, perhaps, rediscover some part of herself that was still worthy of respect. Remorse followed her like a shadow. There was not a day that went by that she did not think about the words she had written in the letters she had given him, the nights when she woke up with her conscience demanding truths from her that she had never known how to deal with. She began therapy, read books on forgiveness, reflected on the distortions she had committed in the name of wounded pride. And, more than anything, she began to accept that losing Daniel had been, above all, a reflection of her own inability to love maturely. Meanwhile, Daniel's new relationship was taking shape. They began to share more than just superficial conversations. They shared silent coffees, unplanned walks, simple dinners at home. Their complicity was slowly built, based on the transparency that he now considered non-negotiable. She knew everything. She knew about his traumas, his hesitations, his uncertainties. And she didn't try to fix anything, she just stayed. And this permanence, so rare, so free of demands, was what began to truly heal the pieces still cracked inside him. Daniel began to dream about the future again, but now with his feet in the present, without idealizations. And this made him stronger. More whole. More capable of understanding the value of the little things. But there was something that still bothered him. A dilemma that he couldn't shake. The fact that, even though he was starting over, part of his new story had been shaped by old lies. Not from the woman he was now with, but by the game of manipulation and silence that Clara had started. He needed to understand to what extent that affected him, to what extent he was still being driven by wounds that weren't his own. One night, he decided to open a box that he had kept in the closet since he moved. Inside were old letters, photos, notes exchanged over the years with Clara, memories that he had avoided for too long. He read everything with a different perspective. No longer as someone who relives, but as someone who analyzes, with the lucidity of someone who now sees flaws where before he saw romance. And he finally realized that that relationship had never been as solid as it seemed. That there had been imbalances from the beginning, that he was too silent, that she was too assertive, and that the betrayal was just the trigger for something that had already been silently breaking. This understanding set him free. The next morning, he sent Clara a short message. Not a request to talk, not a provocation. Just a thank you. He wrote that, despite everything, he was grateful that he had finally seen the truth about himself. And that he hoped she would find peace in her own journey. Clara read the message sitting by a lake, where she spent weekends alone. She cried. But not because of resentment. She cried because she realized that, perhaps, after all, there was a kind of forgiveness there that cannot be named, but can be felt. A kind of closure that does not require reunion, but only maturity. That same week, Daniel received an invitation to speak at an architecture event about the reconstruction of urban spaces. Ironic, he thought. He was rebuilding his own life and now he would be talking about physical restructuring. He accepted the invitation and, in his speech, mixed theory with personal experience. He spoke about how, sometimes, the best way to preserve a structure is to accept that it needs to collapse first. And that rebuilding is not about denying what was, but accepting what can be. At the end of the talk, he received a standing ovation. And there, in front of unfamiliar faces, he felt something he had not felt for a long time, pride in himself. In the days that followed, his routine changed once again. He began to design projects for underprivileged communities, to volunteer at universities, to invest time in social causes that he had previously been unable to get involved with. He discovered that part of his emptiness came from having lived for so long in order to maintain something that, in essence, no longer fulfilled him. And that, now, by giving himself to the world in a different way, by looking beyond his story, he found meaning in what had previously seemed like mere survival. And yet, even with everything flowing, there were times when the shadow of the past would knock on the door. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. That scars don't go away, but they can stop hurting. That starting over doesn't mean forgetting, but learning to remember without bleeding. And Daniel, now, knew how to remember. he also knew where he had gone wrong. He knew that his silence, in the past, had contributed to his downfall. That having swallowed too much, accepted too much, failed to assert himself, was a subtle way of neglecting himself. But he also knew that maturing is looking at one's own mistakes with courage, without victimizing oneself. And he had done that. He was doing that every day. The woman he was now walking with noticed this silent struggle. And she never tried to take anyone's place. On the contrary, she respected the silences, welcomed the pauses, understood the distances. And so Daniel began to love her with the tranquility of someone who has loved too much in the wrong way. He understood that healthy love does not burn, does not demand a show, does not need to prove anything to anyone. It just is. Present. Real. Possible. They were at a delicate moment, that point in history when everything could change direction. A new job offer had come up for her in another city. An important position, a leap in her career. She hesitated when telling him. She didn't want to pressure him into making any decisions. She said she would accept, but that she didn't expect him to change for her. That it could be something good for both of them, but that she understood if he preferred to stay. Daniel, faced with this new dilemma, realized that life was, once again, asking him for courage. And that, this time, he would need to choose based on the present, no longer trying to fix the past. The decision he would make, however, would not be easy. Because more than choosing between staying or leaving, he needed to understand if he was ready to let go of all his ties. If he was prepared to finally live a love without any traces, without reservations, without the shadow of everything that came before. And that answer, he didn't have yet. But he knew he was close. Very close. Daniel walked down the cobblestone street of the old neighborhood with slow but steady steps, the cold wind blowing in his face as a reminder that time did not stop, that the world continued even when inside everything still seemed to be in transition. 2 days had passed since she had revealed her proposal for change, and since then, he had been unable to get the idea of starting over from his mind for real. Not a partial restart, guided by caution and limits, but a real, definitive, bold leap. It affected him in ways he could not explain, because the feeling of freedom was accompanied by the fear of giving up what he had regained with so much effort. It was as if life was asking once again, "Are you ready to let the past die completely?" He remembered a conversation he had had with her a few months earlier, during a quick trip to the countryside, where they had spent a weekend without plans, just sharing time in silence. She had said, looking at the horizon of low hills, that starting over is choosing to die to a previous version of oneself, and that, for many, this morning was unbearable. At the time he had not responded, he had simply kept the phrase as if he were writing down a clue in a riddle that he would only understand later. And now it came back to him with force, because that was exactly what was presented, the chance to bury once and for all the man he had been, the silent husband, the resigned betrayed man, the man who accepted crumbs of affection, and, in its place, allow himself to be someone new. The dilemma was that this new man was not yet fully formed, and the insecurity of the unfinished sometimes hurt more than any loss. That night, he decided to look for her. He couldn't make a decision of that magnitude with silence as his advisor. He found her sitting on the bench on the terrace of her building, wrapped in a blanket and holding a glass of wine. She looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. She only moved her head slightly, signaling for him to sit next to her. Daniel looked up at the sky for a moment, the stars partially hidden by the clouds, and then began to speak. He said he didn't know the answer, but he knew the questions. He no longer wanted to be guided by old fears, but he couldn't deny that he still felt them. She listened to him without interrupting, her eyes moist from the cold breeze or perhaps from the emotion of seeing in him a sincere vulnerability, so different from the armor that many wear when they have to make decisions for love. After a few minutes of shared silence, she spoke. She said she didn't expect him to go with her on impulse, that she didn't want to carry anyone in her baggage if the desire wasn't reciprocal. But she also said she believed in them, even with all the cracks, with all the complexity. That love, true love, wasn't a state, but a daily choice. And that she was there, willing to choose, as long as he was too. Daniel didn't answer right away. They stayed there for a long time, just breathing together, until he hugged her slowly, with a kind of affection that didn't require urgency. A hug that said, "I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm willing to look for them with you." In the following days, Daniel began to prepare himself emotionally for the possibility of leaving. He spoke to his parents and his few close friends, and received various pieces of advice, some filled with fear, others with enthusiasm, but all permeated by the certainty that only he could make this decision. He visited the cultural center once more, this time to say goodbye. When he saw the young people he had worked with, he felt a lump in his throat. He was grateful for that space, for everything he had learned there, but he knew that cycles need to end so that new ones can begin with fullness. He left letters for some of them, messages of encouragement, small unfinished projects that he hoped others could carry on. It was his way of not disappearing, but of transforming himself. The Saturday before she moved, they decided to take a short 2-day trip, without planning, just to feel the lightness of the present. They went to a coastal village, where the sea crashed hard against the rocks and the wind seemed to carry ancient stories. There, they walked along trails, listened to music in hidden cafes, and laughed at simple things. On one of these walks, they stopped at a viewpoint from which they could see the clear horizon. She asked him if he thought courage came from love or fear. Daniel answered without thinking, courage came from recognizing that love is worth more than protection. She smiled, and there, in that moment, he knew the answer. He said he would go with her. That he couldn't guarantee that everything would work out, but that he would rather fail trying than live regretting not having tried. She didn't say anything. She just kissed him, and the kiss was more silent than any promise, but truer than 1,000 words. They returned the next day to pack their bags. She would be leaving in 3 days, and he now had little time to organize his transition. The apartment would be left behind, some of the furniture sold, others donated. He felt light, like someone who had finally understood that he no longer needed to carry the ashes of a past that no longer belonged to him. In the midst of packing, he found a book that Clara had given him years before, with a handwritten dedication. He read it, and for the first time, he felt no pain. Only a kind of serene nostalgia, like someone who visits a house where he was happy but that is no longer his. He put the book in a small box that he would take with him, not as a reminder of pain, but as a marker from which he no longer wanted to return. On the other side of the city, Clara received the news of the move from a mutual friend. She remained silent for a while, and then took a deep breath. She was no longer crying for Daniel, but for the version of herself that had lost him. She called her therapist and scheduled an extra session. She said she needed to close that chapter in a symbolic way. During the session, she wrote a final letter, which she would not deliver. She would burn it later, in a private ceremony in the park where she used to run. And so she did. The next day, at sunset, Clara stood in front of a small makeshift bonfire, quietly read the words that would never be heard, and released the paper into the flames. She cried. But it was a clean cry, from someone who understands that sometimes loving someone means knowing how to let them go, especially when you are no longer able to keep up with them. On the morning of the trip, Daniel woke up early. He looked for the last time at the window of his old apartment, where he had waited so many times for answers that never came. The city was slowly dawning, and with it, his new life was also being born. He went downstairs with 2 suitcases and a lighter heart. He met her in the lobby of the building, and together they went to the airport. They didn't say much on the way. They just held hands, as if they understood that there is something sacred in the silence shared between 2 people who chose each other despite everything. At the boarding gate, they sat side by side and, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt peace. Not that fragile and silent peace that precedes the storm, but the firm peace of someone who has finally understood that they deserve to be happy, and that true happiness does not require perfection, but only courage and presence. They still did not know what the new city would be like, the new challenges, the days ahead. But they knew they were ready. And that was enough. The flight was called. They stood up, walked through the gates together, and disappeared among the other passengers, two among many, but carrying with them a story that few would fully understand. A story of falling, pain, rebuilding, and, above all, choice. Because in the end, it all comes down to this: who we are after everything falls apart, and who we decide to be when we rebuild. Daniel had chosen. And this time, he had chosen himself. And so he was ready to choose love, the true kind, the possible kind, the kind that doesn't hurt to prove that it exists, but that stands firm by simply remaining. Time passed like a silent wave, taking with it the last remnants of a story that had begun with love, foundered in betrayal, and been reborn with conscious choices. Months after the move, Daniel's life had completely transformed, not only due to geography, but also due to the way he now lived in his own home. He adapted naturally to the new city, finding beauty in the details of everyday life, such as the smell of cold morning coffee, the sound of bicycles downtown, the urban art murals that told stories of resistance and hope. The new home was modest but welcoming, and each object that bore his touch was a symbol that he now built with purpose, no longer to please or maintain appearances. His work prospered, social projects gained shape and respect, but it was in the silence of ordinary days that he felt most complete. He no longer needed to prove anything, not to himself, not to the world. The relationship he chose to live alongside the woman who had been just a discreet presence in the midst of his storm blossomed with maturity. They shared decisions, shared difficulties, and celebrated small achievements as great victories. There was no urgency, no games, just a mutual commitment to grow, to repair, to love honestly. On a cold autumn night, sitting under a blanket on the balcony of the apartment, she mentioned the idea of a family for the first time, not in a rush, but as if planting a seed in the other person's heart and seeing if there was fertile ground. Daniel didn't respond immediately, he just smiled and held her hand tightly. In that gesture there was more certainty than any rehearsed answer. It was there, in that carefully constructed present, that he found what he had searched for in vain for years. Meanwhile, in another city, Clara had also redefined her path. Therapy had become an essential part of her routine, not as a magic solution, but as a mirror that forced her to see herself clearly. Working at an NGO focused on women in the process of starting over connected her with realities that she had previously ignored. Each story she heard, each woman she supported, was a reminder of how pain can be transformed into empathy, and how guilt, when faced with courage, can generate transformation. She no longer tried to contact others, no longer sought answers, she had learned to respect the space she had destroyed with her own hands. Certain losses are definitive, and only become bearable when transformed into responsibility. She began to live a simpler, more present life. Every now and then, she would listen to music that reminded her of the past, and in those moments she would cry, not for the absence of the other, but for the version of herself that she had failed to love. This mourning was constant, but it was also a sign that something inside her was still seeking redemption. A year has passed since that departure. On a sunny afternoon, Daniel walked hand in hand with his companion through a street fair. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees and drew shadows on the stone floor. They stopped at a ceramic stall, and between laughter and indecisive choices, they decided to buy two identical mugs. It was just a silly purchase, but at that moment, Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. It was the first time in many years that he found himself naturally planning the future. Without fear. Without doubts. That mug was not just an object, it was a symbol. Of the simplicity that he had previously despised, of the intimacy built without haste, of the life possible after the shipwreck. That same night, Clara received a call. It was a woman from the NGO with whom she had shared many difficult journeys. The call was not about work, but an invitation, to speak at an event about emotional reconstruction. Clara hesitated, but accepted. She wrote her speech carefully, not setting herself up as an example, but as a witness to mistakes that taught her more than any book could. On stage, her voice trembled, but her words were true. When she finished, she received restrained but sincere applause. And there, in that moment, she understood that dignity can be regained, not by trying to erase the past, but by the courage to accept it and walk differently. It was the most she could do. And for now, it was enough. On the other side of life, the former boss, the one who served as a catalyst for the downfall and learning of so many, was also reaping the fruits of his choices. After a series of internal complaints, not only related to his personal life, but also to the way he conducted business with disrespect and manipulation, he ended up being removed from the board of directors and exposed in social circles where he had previously reigned with ease. He lost contracts, partnerships and, more than that, he lost his mask. His reputation, built on charm and influence, dissolved like smoke. He was left with the loneliness of those who use people as disposable parts. And by a bitter irony of fate, he realized that no one, absolutely no one, remained by his side when everything fell apart. He was alone. And it was then that he understood, too late, that choices have weight, and the price of vanity is not always exacted immediately, but when it is, it exacts an unpayable interest. The story of that trio ended as all great stories end, with new beginnings. Daniel, now a whole man, still with scars but unafraid of them, continued his life with purpose and truth. Clara, aware of the extent of her failures, transformed her pain into service and began anew with humility. And the one who started everything with arrogance faced the cruel mirror of his own destruction. Life, in the end, neither forgives nor punishes, it only reveals. And when the veil falls, what remains is the truth. Each in their own way, had to deal with the consequences of their actions. Each now carried the reflection of what they chose to be when everything fell apart. And you, who have followed this story so far, tell us, what did you think of this outcome? Do you think Daniel made the right choice? And Clara, did she deserve a second chance or was the forgiveness she received enough? Comment below with your opinion, we really want to know what you felt when you heard this story. And if you've made it this far, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Here, every week, you'll hear exciting stories, with surprising twists and endings that make you reflect on life, choices, and especially, the consequences of betrayal. Because this story shows, like so many others we tell here, that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys dreams, trust, memories, entire families. It changes the course of the lives of those who truly love. And so, we make it clear once again, this channel does not support, does not justify and will never romanticize any form of betrayal. Until the next story. Take care, and choose with your heart. But choose truthfully.